Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome to today's webinar on climate change and global fires. Sadly, as we have seen across the world, climate change is increasingly driving wildfires, and the business community has begun to reckon with the impacts, with the reinsurance industry reclassifying fires as a primary rather than a secondary peril. However, current catastrophe models don't handle fire well, and few understand what drives it and how it impacts nature and society. This morning's webinar seeks to enhance our understanding of wildfires with case studies from the Mediterranean, Europe, Australia, California, and the Amazon, explaining why it's such a wicked problem characterised by uncertainty, complexity, variability, and disagreement over how to manage the disastrous consequences. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr Simon Pooley, a Lambert Lecturer in Environment and Sustainability at Birkbeck University of London. Simon's work focuses on wildfires, bioinvasions, and human-wildfire conflicts and coexistence. Before I hand over to Simon to impart some of his knowledge, please bear with me for some brief housekeeping points. I'm Charlotte Dilber-Ashley, and I'm fortunate enough to manage the FS Club here at ZN, and I'd like to warmly acknowledge our very generous sponsors, who enable us to continue to bring you a wide range of thought-provoking content across finance, technology, and economics, and how these fundamental topics are impacted by the environment in multifaceted ways. The slides for this presentation are publicly available on our website and in the chat box, and the session will be recorded and available to watch on our website within 48 hours. And we'll also be holding a 20-minute Q&A session after Simon's presentation. So please use the GoToWebinar facility to send your questions into me, and then I'll feed them into the conversation. Now, I'll get out of your way and leave you in Simon's capable hands.
Okay, so I've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to get right to it. As Charlotte said, we're seeing fire really come up as a risk. The World Economic Forum's Global Risks Report this year has a look over a 10-year horizon at long-term threats to the world, and environmental risks are in the 5 most critical, and climate action failure, extreme weather, and biodiversity loss are ranked as the top 3 most severe risks. And as Charlotte was saying, this is really being picked up on by the reinsurance industry in particular. So, for example, that quote, in the US, wildfire is now being treated as a primary peril. And this is them picking up a 30% rise in the number of major wildfires over the last 15 years. And then another quote from Swiss Re, acknowledging that while the science is at a relatively early stage, the industry can't afford to wait and see. The numbers of fires and heat waves tell us something's happening and action needs to be taken. And so I'm just going to summarize this very quickly, but we can see here weather-related disasters really picking up since the 90s. We can see here cumulative global insured losses by peril since 1950. This is in US dollars, billions of dollars, and this is looking at the environmental ones. So the big ones are, of course, tropical cyclones, storms in the US, and importantly, flooding in the UK, for example, where I'm sitting. And then right at the bottom there, you can see coming up since about 2015, suddenly you're seeing wildfires emerging. And there's a figure there of $25 billion US on global wildfire losses from between 2019 and 21. Insurers paying out $17 billion of that, and that's coming from a figure from Munich Re. And again, their figures there just showing you since about 2015 a really big rise in what we're looking at, losses due to wildfire. So what I'm going to try and very quickly do with a complex subject is just talk briefly about what fire is. It's a question most people don't ask, but if you stop and try and define it for yourself, you'll realize it's not straightforward. I'll talk about ecological effects and then go very quickly through 3 sort of case studies that cover various dimensions of what we're facing, and end up by briefly saying why I think wildfire is a wicked problem. So what is fire? Technically, it's a rapid chemical oxidative reaction generating heat, light, and producing a range of chemical products. So what does it need? It needs an ignition source, it needs dry fuel, something to burn in other words, and it needs oxygen. So there on the fire triangle below that text, you can see we need heat. So heat warms up the properties of things, the cellulose, whatever it is in the cell walls, and then it interacts with the gas is released and you get combustion, and then we have a go. And then in the natural world, it's lightning. If you look at that map of the world, you can see the regions with a lot of natural fire, very much related to lightning patterns. But of course, increasingly, the source of ignitions is us. And we've seen all these results coming out of the various IPCC reports. This is from the latest AR6. And I'm just going to pick out the things related to fire, but of course, temperature is very important for fire. And as we all now know, the projections are going one way, and that suggests we're going to be looking at conditions much more conducive to fires. Again, here, don't worry too much about the detail. The point is, the big point here is the change in annual mean precipitation, and it's patchy, as you can see. So some places will get drier and some places will get wetter with different effects. So the drying out, for example, of northeastern South America is going to see the potential for the Amazon to dry out and more fires. In other places like the Mediterranean regions of the world, more rainfall might mean more vegetation growth in the winter, leaving a lot more material, fuel to burn over the subsequent summer. So wind, we've learned that in the face of very high wind speeds, there's virtually nothing you can do. So like those roaring Santa Ana winds coming down from the interior of the American West down over California, when it's really blowing, basically you just get out the way. So, and we're also seeing projected increases in wind speeds. So all of these things are likely to affect fire. And finally, atmospheric CO2 concentrations. We all know these are climbing steeply. Why does this matter for fire? So this is a chart just showing the effect of increasing CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere on different kinds of plants. So there are two main photosynthetic strategies or pathways that plants have evolved to deal with CO2 to get carbon out of the atmosphere. And as you'll see there, the CO3 plants, the dark green line, the more carbon, the better, more CO2, the better. So the more there is, the greater the productivity. And that's very different to the CO4 plants, so evolved a bit later, mostly grasses. They level off after a certain point. And so what we're seeing in the world right now is what you might call a kind of bushing up. So you're seeing in particularly deserted landscapes in the Mediterranean, for example, closing in of scrub. So it's favoring scrub, shrubs and trees over grasses. So you're seeing more material to burn. So changes to fire regimes. So what do vegetation fires do? That's my focus here. Essentially, fires behave like a generalist herbivore. They kind of eat, they consume all vegetation types. They're not selective. Fires produce inorganic ash and charcoal, which remains more or less in place. And then they produce volatile chemicals and compounds, aerosols, and both have very significant environmental impacts. And in particular here, I'll just single out huge impacts on pollution, air pollution, with very significant health impacts. So my cousin, who lives just north of San Francisco, the last couple of summers has had to keep her daughter inside during the day in the summertime, which is really not Californian, because of the extremely bad air quality coming out of the fires. Huge issues in Indonesia with those really big peat fires. So people are draining peatlands so that they can plant oil palms, and once it's dry, it can burn. And peat burns very slowly, and every part of it burns up and it creates these huge and lasting smoke clouds with very severe health issues. Kinds of fires, so there's three sort of main categories here. There are surface or brush fires that spread along the ground through low-lying vegetation, through grass, tends to burn grass and underbrush. So even in a forested area, it'll just pass through under the trees. A crown fire is where the fire spreads up into the crowns of the trees and shrubs, and this can happen, for example, where traditional management's been reduced, prescribed burning, or animals that eat that underbrush have been removed, and the fires get up into the trees, and they're very big, intense fires. And then I just mentioned the peat fire. These are unusual. They burn underground, actually, and they can burn, they burn very slowly, but for a very long time. They're quite intense. Grass fires, surface fires are often quicker and much less intense. So the fire regime concept is an important one. It's a fire regime. It's like the typical climate for a particular area. The fire regime is an amalgam of various aspects of fires in a landscape over time. These are the fire spread patterns, the fire intensity, and that's driven by things like what's growing there, the fuel, the size and distributions of the patches of the fires, and the frequency of the fires, how often they come around, and the seasonality. And so you can see, for example, on the animation of Africa, or well, of the animation of the world, you can see there are very distinct seasonal patterns in where fires are happening. And from the Africa map there, each of those blocks is a month. And you can see that essentially the fires move south as the year goes on. So from right up in the Sahel in the early part of the year, sort of moving southwards towards December. So very distinctive patterns at a macro level. The severity of fires is influenced by wind speed, temperature, and humidity. That, of course, influences how flammable the vegetation is. And those three things, as we've seen, climate change is really pushing. We're seeing big changes coming. And also the type of fuel and the conditional dryness of what's available to burn. And that's, of course, very much affected by us as well. What we plant in places or introduce invasive plants, for example, can really change local conditions, fire regimes. So building on that idea of regimes, this ecological concept of the disturbance regime, it refers to the totality of different kinds of disturbance events happening in a system. Each of these is characterized by its probability of occurrence, the intensity, and other attributes like the seasonal pattern. And the point here is that it's been recognized that changes in fire disturbance regimes are a kind of canary in the mine shaft there, and an early indicator of coming major terrestrial ecosystem changes. And yeah, so on the graphics there, you can see quite significant projected changes in forest fire danger indexes over a 100-year period, so 1970 to 99 on the left, and then the projection 100 years forward. Very significant increases in the danger index in Central and Western North America, in Northeastern South America, across Africa, really coming into play around the Mediterranean region of Europe, and of course in Australia as well. So closest to where I am now in the Mediterranean basin in Europe, but of course also applying to the other Mediterranean regions around the world. Mediterranean climates are really ideal for fire. They have these short, mild winters where the rain falls and the vegetation grows, and then they have the long, hot, windy summer when it dries out and is good to burn. And we have projections that the Mediterranean region of Europe is warming up and drying out, and fires are becoming more intense and difficult to control. We've certainly seen that in recent summers, big fires in Spain, for example. This summer we've just come through. Fire regimes are changing also due to human movements, rural depopulation, land abandonment, and that's also compounded by less livestock out there grazing down the vegetation. With CO2 and abandonment of land practices, the fields are getting more shrubby, more dense with vegetation. And on top of that, people are planting up, replacing these old farmlands with plantations of pines and eucalypts, and they have very heavy fuel loads. So when they get burning, they really burn. Some of the imported shrubs and trees are also, they're actually better adapted to fire. They come back quicker than the indigenous vegetation, and they are invading local ecosystems, and they burn more intensely than the indigenous veg. And of course, we've seen major tourist development along the coasts, and that's increased the interface between urban areas and the wildlands, bringing in more fire ignitions, and holiday makers come in the worst season, they come in the fire season. Finally, in terms of management, we've seen urban fire brigades replacing the old forestry departments. They don't really do fire prevention, they don't really have bush firefighting skills, they don't do prescribed block burning, and people don't like it, it's unpopular, and it's happening very sporadically. Essentially in the EU, for example, and this has certainly been the pattern in the US, the money's been spent mainly on firefighting rather than fire prevention. I'm sure all of you will be familiar with the summer 2019-20 Australian bushfires, so a huge area of bush forest, parks burned, people died, over 2,500 homes were reduced to scrap. If you look at that picture there, I mean, really destroyed by fire. We've seen similar around the world, terrible fires in California, for example. A huge amount of hazardous air produced, spreading as far as New Zealand and even South America. You can see the bottom right there, bushfire smoke hanging over Sydney, and big impacts on biodiversity. So millions of animals killed, 3 billion affected. So of course, Australian animals are used to fires, but normally it's quite patchy and they can move to a different part of their habitat. The fires were so big in this case that some populations of animals lost their entire habitats. So the causes are human and natural, they're anthropogenic causes. Of course, climate change is anthropogenic as well, but there's the usual, there's arson and accidents, the Barbie blowing over in the wind, and poor management and policy, partly coming out of climate change denialism, which has characterized past Australian governments, hopefully changing now. So this results in failure to enforce building standards and zoning, so people are allowed to build in high fire risk areas, and they are allowed to use flammable materials. So the natural causes, the hot and dry climates resulting in more frequent and intense fires, and we're looking particularly at hotter temperatures and prolonged droughts. That made it much easier for the fires to spread and grow. So looking at the fire weather in Australia in the period running up to the 2019 fires, more than 95% of the country had forest fire danger index values above average, and 60% of Australia, in fact, had record-breaking values. So it was really primed to burn. And of course, fires make their own weather. They drive thunderstorms, so they create thunderstorms, and this produces lightning, and this can start even more fires. So finally then, with apologies to Jeff Bezos, well, not really, but my question is, will the Amazon kindle? We've seen sea surface temperature increasing in the tropical North Atlantic, and this is resulting in frequent severe drought episodes in the Amazon region. We've seen increases in tree mortality through drought and increasing forest fire occurrence. And of course, the fire risk has been majorly exacerbated by land use, particularly under Jair Bolsonaro. So there's been an increase in logging and clearing of land for beef and soya farming, often using fire. This causes also habitat fragmentation, which lets in grasses which like to burn, and fires come into former rainforest areas. So in sum here, we're seeing severe drought episodes, land use impacts, and fire interacting synergistically. So often previously people looked at these risks, these drivers of ecological change separately and individually, and then just thought the change might be additive, but actually what we see is that these drivers interact synergistically and the impacts are collectively larger than they actually would have been predicted to be if you just looked at them individually. And essentially what we're seeing here is a movement to a transition of mature Amazon forests to fire-adapted savanna vegetation. So a fairly major change. So to finish up, why is fire a wicked problem? What is a wicked problem? It's a problem that avoids straightforward articulation, and which is impossible to solve in a way that's simple, that's universal, so your solution works everywhere, or final. Fire can't be solved. Climate change, as we know, is a multi-dimensional social and ecological phenomenon. We're very much bound up in the causes of it, and it's characterized by high uncertainty, by complexity, by variability and disagreement over what it is and what we should do about it. And so very much is wildfire. People understand fire in different ways. There are still arguments among scientists about how fire works in landscapes. Some people still dispute that fire importantly shapes what grows where, whereas others like William Bond argue that these large open ecosystems that we see where trees could grow but don't, that's because of fires. This really influences things like this. Response to climate change, that we should plant lots of trees. Well, it depends. Some landscapes really probably shouldn't have trees. So this influences management. People manage fire in very different ways, depending on their desired outcomes. Whether you, for example, a crop farmer or a pastoralist, you would burn or not burn for different reasons. So people are burning to either avoid fire, to try and burn fire breaks to stop big fires, or to achieve different goals like grazing, similar. Major fire policies are still shaped by colonial era assumptions. So large parts of the world, it was assumed that landscapes had been transformed by harmful indigenous burning across India, for example, across large parts of Africa, and this unfortunately still influences thinking on burning practices in the Sahel, for example. The FAO still classifies many landscapes as degraded woodlands, that should be forest, when actually arguably they are fire-adapted savanna landscapes. So there are narrow sectoral goals, for example, so pastoral people who want to burn for grazing versus foresters who don't want any fire at all. And some of the fire science is really just outdated, so it's been very influenced by Northern Hemisphere thinking developed in different sorts of climatic zones. And then fire, of course, interacts in very complicated ways with climate and vegetation and animals, herbivores of different kinds, and human land use. So it's not possible to sort of isolate it, to study it in isolation. You need to understand the fundamental message of ecology, that everything is connected. So the many drivers then, to summarize, shaping fire regimes include this intensification of fire weather I've been talking about, longer fire seasons now, very notable in California, for example, increasing CO2 levels, which, as I've said, influences the vegetation too very much, invasive alien plants and introduced inflammable plants, which change the fire regimes of places, making them more inflammable, notably Australian plants, wattles and eucalypts spread around the world, for example. We're seeing synergies between climate change, human land use, and vegetation change in the Amazon, for example. Rural land abandonment's been a significant issue in Mediterranean Europe, for example, in other places. And contrary-wise, urban sprawl, pushing all sorts of ignitions into rural areas. And finally, there's the complexity that burning practices and policies vary very widely, both within regions and across regions. So there's a lot of different ideas on burning spread across the United States, for example. And we're seeing, there are even cultural dimensions of this. For example, research shows in Africa on a weekly basis, burning patterns vary according to religion. People burn or don't burn on particular days. So there are many reasons, and people burn for so many different reasons in landscape. So I'm going to leave you just with this slightly more complicated diagram than that simple triangle I introduced fire with. And that's really just to show that those three main things we looked at, factors we looked at in that initial diagram, and the red circles in the middle, the fuels, the ignitions, and the sort of temperature and heat, all of these sorts of things are bound up with the climate, with atmospheric chemistry, with the land cover and vegetation composition, which is impacted by human land use. Soils, of course, influencing what grows where. All of these things affect fire, and fire in turn influences land cover and soils and land use and atmospheric chemistry. So the take home, I guess, and I'm going to finish now, is simply that in order to deal with these kinds of major environmental challenges that we're facing, these are wicked problems. You know, this big focus, to my mind, on CO2 and climate has been popular because it's relatively simple, but actually we need to face a complicated system, and fire really brings that out. It really brings into play all of these different elements. So thanks for your attention, and I will leave that there.
Thank you very much for that informative presentation, Simon. You did a great job of summarising a lot of complex information in a short time. So audience, please keep sending your questions in using the chat facility. To begin, Clive Fullen's asked, is there any recommendations you have of what we can do to help mitigate all of this, both in terms of personal day-to-day action and bigger long-term strategic actions?
So there are. So it does vary by region. So it's not worth. I won't go into the fact, general things like, trying to keep CO2 out of the atmosphere. But one of the things we've seen with rural land abandonment is a vacuum of management of rural landscapes, and really reintroducing the kind of rural burning practices onto that land is a very important thing to do. Definitely in Mediterranean type regions, for example. So ecologically informed prescribed burning is a very good idea, but it requires a government, or it requires serious support. And so where burning is in the hands of local authorities who are responsible to elected officials, that's quite difficult, because people can put pressure on those people not to burn. Most people don't like fires, they're frightened of them. They don't like the smoke and the rest of it. Zoning is a huge, is something we really need to focus on better. So all these, so AXA, the reinsurance giant, they have a division that looks specifically at climate risks and fires, and they've realized that the modeling is poor. We really need to improve the modeling for fire to understand vulnerability in landscapes at finer scales. So one of the problems there is most of the data that exists and is freely available is for the United States. Really harder to come by that data for elsewhere, or you need to pay lots of money to get it. We need better data and better access, and to inform better modeling of where landscapes are vulnerable. Because of course a knock-on here is, for example, companies like, I think in Canada, some very big fires resulting in companies deciding not to insure people anymore living in those areas. So there are going to be difficulties for people getting any kind of insurance cover in certain of these landscapes. Certainly, while this great degree of uncertainty exists, in terms of predicting what's going to happen. So those are a few thoughts.
And then we have got from Colin Colson Thomas, is there a potential conflict between planning, conservation and tree preservation policies in residential areas and fire prevention?
It's an interesting one. So my alma mater, one of my alma maters, is the University of Cape Town, and they had flammable trees that University of Cape Town is on the slopes of Table Mountain, which is naturally fynbos. There's only one kind of tree that grows out there in the fynbos, but they had a lot of ornamental introduced trees, some of them quite inflammable, on campus, and they shed their leaves, and the leaves got into the gutters, and they had a massive fire. And it burnt down the entire library, and a lot of damage was done. So yes, you need to manage those sorts of trees in urban areas. Is that a conservation issue? Conservation issue is more to do with, I would say, at the moment, this idea of planting lots of trees into areas where there aren't naturally trees. And we're also seeing difficulties around the kind of bush encroachment, and because of changing CO2 levels and changes to land management. And there's some solutions, and surprisingly a good one is a combination of burning and goats. So goats get a bad press, but in Africa, in California actually, they're really good because they're browsers. So essentially around the world, Europeans have traveled around the world and taken their livestock with them, and they're mostly grazers. And the wildlife has been the browsers that eats the trees and the shrubs and things. They've been wiped out and replaced by only grazers. So goats are quite important. If you burn and then you put the goats in, they take out the saplings coming up, and they can control this kind of bush encroachment, which is transforming some of the naturally open areas.
Thank you. And Hugh Purse has asked, are there any parts of the world that are getting fire management right?
Ooh, patchy, yeah. I think the Australians have been quite interesting in trying to learn from Aboriginal burning practices, early season burning. What's difficult is then scientists get excited about a practice and try and transport it to other parts of the world. There's been a recommendation recently that we must take these learnings from Aboriginal people to Africa, which is just annoying because Africans traditionally burnt early and have had a very long history of being told not to by colonial and post-colonial authorities. So we certainly can learn more from indigenous burning practices to a degree. But of course, landscapes have been greatly transformed. There's been good research done in the Southwestern Cape in South Africa, understanding the ecology of burning in the fynbos landscapes. The science is really good, but very difficult to make it happen in terms of the management. So it's that trying to get the science into the management and the policy. I wrote a book called Burning Table Mountain about just how difficult this is in practice. I think there's learning from Amerindian practices been going on in parts of the US. Florida were really early adopters. Ed Komarek, Tall Timbers, very early adopters of understanding the ecological importance of fire in landscapes. So yes, I mean there are areas of the world. It's not that the science is behind. The challenge is how do you integrate the science into management and keep managers up to date with how the ecology is developing, the ecological thinking and the policy. How do you integrate those three things? You essentially need constant and ongoing discussion and planning between scientists, so doing the blue sky stuff, and managers and policymakers. The three of those really need to be talking to each other all the time.
And Charles Henderson has asked, how does the current situation compare to Valerie Truitt's Tree Story, the history of the world written in rings?
So I'm not actually, could you repeat the last part of that?
So he's asking how this situation compares to the Tree Story, the history of the world written in rings. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
No, if he could unpack that in a couple of sentences, I could try responding. I actually don't know that. It sounds interesting.
I'll leave him some time to just type in the chat there. And then we'll go on to another question by Hubersa. So the ranking table you showed in slide 2, insured losses by peril, shows wildfires at number 8. How do you think this table might change in the next 10 to 20 years or so?
Well, that's a tough one. I mean, I think, you know, the thing about these sorts of tables, it's influenced by all kinds of things, right? So it's influenced by which companies are counting, which areas they're insuring. So we need to, in the first instance, point out that there's a difference between actually what's going on in fire on the planet and what's being insured. I would predict that this is heading north, if you like, because it's going to be influenced by others of these factors. So the increases we're seeing in various climate drivers, drought is one of the factors that you see on here. So I would say it's going to go up. There are other factors that influence this sort of thing. So inflation. So at the moment we're seeing, you know, the cost of rebuilding is more. There are a variety of other things that are also going to drive this kind of chart. So I would say we're looking at wildfire continuing to become a risk. I'm not sure, you know, regionally it's going to vary. So in the UK, I would say we shouldn't ignore fire. We're beginning to see summer fires. There's a lot of peat that we need to try and keep wet. There are parts of the world, huge parts of the world in the Arctic Circle, which are now starting to burn, which we should be worried about, which didn't used to. Australia, you know, parts of North America, northeastern Latin America, particularly around the Med in Europe. There are places that all the projections show wildfires are going up. So I would say, yeah, it's going to vary regionally. So in terms of the UK, for example, you're probably still going to be more worried about flooding, whether it's around the coast or inland, than wildfire, but it's going to be creeping up. In other parts of the world, wildfire might become one of the more significant risks on this table.
Okay. And Charles has explained that the book talks about how climate can be tracked by tree ring history, including droughts and forest fires. So the book shows that there's been similar periods of extreme drought in the past, presumably resulting in similar forest fires. He says there's also Pacific and Atlantic sea conditions that have resulted in conditions for some of these impacts.
Yeah, so obviously an interesting, well, interesting is one way of putting it. Development has been this very unusual for at least, you know, as long as humans have been around, this very unusual increase in CO2, which is pushing a lot of the buttons that lead to more fire. So there have been periods in Earth history when there have been more fires in different parts of the world, and we've seen major differences in where forests and trees occur, you know, driven by glaciers and those sorts of factors. But this is different, I think. I think the anthropogenic dimension of this is pushing us into an unstable area where we've benefited from a very long, very stable period. It's in geological terms recent, but for the entire stretch of human civilization, you know, that level of human activity and organization on Earth, we've been living through a very stable period. And I do think we're now being pushed into an increasingly unstable and uncertain period in our history, and fires are certainly part of that, a very visible part of that. I'm not sure if that's a difference to what she's arguing or not. It's certainly not the case that fires haven't happened before in history. Earth's history, but they have fluctuated, you know, with the arrival of grasslands, for example. There have been different evolutionary moments when fire has developed, or, you know, had periods of higher incidence. And we've seen this in Africa. I've written a history of fire in Africa, and we've seen over the very deep history, it was usually in the sort of interglacial periods that you saw big flare-ups of fire. And the only time that's not happened has been through human influence. So we are, fire is one of the places we show up in the geological record of having impacts. So some people even date the Anthropocene, this is a very minor view, but date the Anthropocene back to the control of fire by humans, because it was the first time humans could influence land, influence the environment at landscape scale, was when they could deliberately burn for various reasons.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one quick last question here. So James McGuire has asked if you can comment on the intersection of insurance and public balance sheet. As an example, to get a home mortgage in California, you must buy property insurance, including against the peril of fire. But the trend in California is for insurers to withdraw from these specific zip codes, both LA County and in Northern California, where wildfires frequently occur. So it remains to be seen if states or national government will assume this risk.
Yeah, I mean, I can't comment in detail on the situation in California, but I think it's a very interesting development. I think we're heading into very interesting territory here, and it won't just be California at all. And it is a question then of who steps up and takes on that risk, and, you know, whether people can continue to live in certain places. The question is, should they be living in certain landscapes, and there should, if it is government, they're going to have to respond through more direct policy and action. So, for example, maintenance of power lines, a huge source of, so infrastructural causes of fires are significant in California and elsewhere. And they're going to have to really think hard about zoning and enforcing, you know, that places have proper fire evacuation plans, that they build with less flammable materials. That, you know, there was the terrible example of that town Paradise that was completely burnt out. There was just no way really for people to get out of there once the fire was going. And I think possibly what we'll see is, if governments are having to step up, there may be, at least at state level, no expert on how things work out in the States, there may be more interventionist policy on where you can build and how you can build, and the, you know, municipalities and the rest of it having to have and maintain communication and evacuation plans, all these sorts of things in areas that burn. So we've already seen this also in Canada, as I mentioned earlier. So companies not being willing to insure people against fire in certain landscapes. It's a bigger question for climate change in general, but fire, it's been, you know, sort of, I think, interesting. Good question.
Well, Nikki Holtzhausen says a very big thank you to you, Simon, for some much needed insights, and I definitely agree with that. I'm sure our audience does as well. Apologise if we didn't get time to answer your question, but these will be directly emailed to Simon, so he can get in touch with you, and his contact details are on the slides too if you wanted to follow up about anything. So thank you very much, and thank you again to our wonderful sponsors for making these webinars possible. And thank you to our very inquisitive audience for your time and contributions this morning. And don't forget to check out our other webinars we have coming up this week, including an in-person roundtable event on sustainability. And yes, I look forward to seeing you at a webinar again in the future. Thank you very much.